Hello. Our question for today is, how did the African American civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s address the failures of the Reconstruction? There are a few things we need to consider when reading this question. First of all, we need to recognize the connection between the Reconstruction era and the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 1960s. This also means that we need to be sure to have evidence from both the 50s and the 60s. According to ushistory.org, Reconstruction is the period following the Civil War of rebuilding the United States. It was a time of great pain and endless questions. According to this, the Reconstruction era was a time of great uncertainty. There was much confusion about the country's journey for where it would be going in the next few years, after one of the most significant events in United States history, the Civil War. For the reason that the Civil War was fought on the basis of slavery, people in the United States were unsure what the coming journey for African Americans would hold. This uneasiness carried all the way through the 1950s and 1960s during the African American civil rights movement. We can see this through the several murders and protests that led to mass riots involving African Americans that swept the United States in the 1950s and 1960s. At the time, Reconstruction seemed like a good idea. It was meant to better our country. However, StudyMode.com states Reconstruction was a failure due to the collapse of the radical Republican Party, the lack of acceptance of former slaves by whites, and their unwillingness to give African Americans the rights they deserved. It is evident that these losses would be long-lasting, especially the refusal to give African Americans proper rights. Even though Reconstruction happened in the mid to late 1800s, many murders that happened during the 1950s and 1960s are a direct connection. Since African Americans were not given equal rights earlier in history, violent murders such as the murder of Emmett Till took place. If Till had the rights that every other white man had, he would have never been beaten to death. The murder of Medgar Evers, occurring almost 10 years after Till's murder, proves that the failures of Reconstruction were evident for the majority of the African American civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s. On to our next point. Another reason why the failures of the Reconstruction era reoccurred in the African American civil rights movement is the repetitive amount of protests that led to aggressive riots. For instance, the Freedom Riders were not intentionally violent by any means. According to History.com, they tried to use whites-only restrooms and lunch counters and vice versa. These were only peaceful protests and were never meant to turn violent. However, they turned out differently. Unfortunately, they outbroke into riots involving massive beatings of African Americans. African Americans were most targeted during these. Other examples of these violent riots include the Selma to Montgomery March, Watts riots, and the 1967 race riots. If there was not such a hatred or lack of rights for African Americans during this time, these events would rarely or never occur. But we can see that the hatred and lack of rights tie back to the failures of Reconstruction after the Civil War. Reconstruction seemed like a plan that would help our country prosper back in the mid to late 1800s. However, our country experienced new uprisings in the 50s and 60s, including the African American Civil Rights Movement. Our country changed a lot over the course of 100 years. Reconstruction ended up to be a system that would leave the United States with many unanswered questions concerning the path of African Americans. As a result, the failures of Reconstruction immensely reappeared. The reoccurring murders and unsuccessful protests that were discussed in this podcast can explain this. Something the country originally thought would be beneficial ended up to be the complete opposite, and this was shown through the struggles of the African American Civil Rights Movement.